We continue the program, about to introduce a panel discussion, the subject matter sponsorship trends for 2019. And to moderate the first panel of the day, please welcome the Senior Associate at Minter Ellison, Cassandra Heilbronn.
Thanks very much, George, and happy birthday, TP. I didn't even know. I feel pretty bad, but we'll have to sing you happy birthday later. I can't see you. Oh, there you are. We'll make sure we do it at the end of this session. But first, I'll introduce my panel members. We've got three this morning. I was going to say this afternoon. Gosh. We've got Sam, we've got Jeremy, and we've got Andrew. So if you could all welcome them to the stage, please. So thanks, Kylie, for that amazing keynote this morning. It certainly set the tone for today and those activations. I cannot wait to see them at the new Marvel Stadium. So we're going to be talking about sponsorship this morning. And usually when we're talking about sponsorship, we're thinking about the players being the number one asset. But in terms of goodwill and capital growth, sponsorship is where we need to keep looking. And you just have to look at that Marvel Stadium and the ingenuity behind all those activations. It's just simply amazing. But today we're going to have a look at the traditional forms of sponsorship, which will always remain. But then we need to look at a new level of sponsorship, which we've heard over the last few days about what businesses need to do in order to be savvy and to keep up with the rest of them, and also to maintain those sponsorship dollars. But of course, keep the fans engaged and the athletes happy. So in this day and age, we've also got the added social responsibility, I guess, as we turn away from the alcohol, cigarette, and to an extent, the betting-based focused sponsorship. So today we're joined by a number of panellists who are going to share their views, and I'll hand over to them and get them to introduce themselves and tell us a bit about what they do. So Sam?
Morning all, Sam Christou, GM Commercial Development at the Football Federation. This is a new experience to me, but not so different. I've actually been at the FFA for 5 months, and prior to that at Google for quite some time, and this venue was quite popular. We used to attend the International Movie Convention, so following Kylie probably doesn't feel too unfamiliar, but excited to kind of share thoughts, certainly around my first 5 months in sport.
Fantastic. Jeremy?
My name's Jeremy Loeliger. I'm the CEO of the National Basketball League. I've been there now for 3.5 years, and since the redevelopment of the NBL 2.0, so it's now a privately owned sporting league, which is a pretty novel environment to be in from an Australian point of view, and yeah, look forward to sharing my experiences.
Andrew Baxter. I'm a senior advisor now at KPMG. Before that, I used to run a couple of the large advertising agencies in the country, and I've also had I sit on the advisory board at the NBL, used to chair Melbourne Aces in the Australian Baseball League, and have also chaired St Kilda Footy Club's Revenue and Sponsorship Advisory Board in the past, so a bit of a combined background.
That's it. All right, well, Andrew, let's start with you. So KPMG has the global sports network, and we're able to evaluate trends of sports worldwide. And if we look at world trade, sports actually takes up 6%, which is quite a lot in terms of dollar figures. So what have you seen by way of changes to sponsorship approaches and consumer trends over the past, say, 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I think I might start with the consumer, because I think the consumer, as we saw from Kylie's presentation, the consumer's far more savvy from a media point of view than they ever have been. So I think they can see the link with sponsors much more clearly and directly than they have before. And I think, you know, if you're thinking about your own sporting team, I mean, they actually have a really interesting point of view on the sponsors that do sponsor their team. I think from a sponsor's point of view, I think there's been a shift away from just pure eyeballs and reach to fan engagement and emotional connection, and it's interesting to see the True North guys that have got their new research on everyone's desk that actually talks exactly about that. So I think we've gone through a phase over the last probably 10 years, not even the last 2 or 3, where we've gone from really sponsorship just driving mass awareness. We then went through a phase about 10 years ago where people, cottoned on to leveraging sponsorship really well, and you think about Myer and what they've done with horse racing and the fashions on the field, and you think about, what Garnier did many years ago with the Australian Open. They really activated those sponsorships, and I think now it's being much more driven about that emotional connection and ROI. I mean, I think that's the ROI at the end of the day that sponsors are looking for, and I think about someone like KFC, who've supported cricket very heavily for the last 10 years, but that's had a very commercial outcome for them, and I think that's what sponsors are now looking for.
Perfect. And Sam, we've got the benefit of the FFA Annual Report that's just come out, and it had over 132 million in revenue. We've seen an increase in the sponsorship revenue over the past couple of years. So what's the FFA managing to do to keep on top of this, increase the sponsorship revenue, but also keep those fans engaged?
Yeah, probably a couple of things. First and foremost, we benefit from a 4-year cycle, and that was actually the peak of our cycle, which is great. As you'd expect, we now kind of come off that, so it'll be a more challenging 12 months ahead. But certainly from a sponsorship standpoint, there's probably 3 things. First, and probably the one that comes through day to day, is our contracting really looks to call out what we expect to be an increased cost of servicing. So ultimately, and I think we spoke about this yesterday through some of the panels, we make sure that there's growth built into those long-term partnerships, and we have been lucky to have long-term partners. So Hyundai was there on day one for us with the establishment of the Hyundai A-League back in 2005. We've had Westfield as a sponsor of women's football across our national teams, the Matildas, and the W League for the better part of 10 years plus, NAB, Qantas and others. So I think with that longevity, you actually get to test and learn and literally reiterate and make sure that those folks, as Andrew mentioned, are getting value and they're seeing that value and they're there for the long term. And then the third element is probably, again, what we touched on yesterday. We've been really strong around looking at new revenue opportunities. So for us, as Danny mentioned yesterday, the E-League was something that we launched last year, the first esports competition in Australia. We'll be looking to grow that as we go into season 2, kicking off in February. So that itself is bringing what sponsors want, which is connection with a different audience, certainly from a Gen Z standpoint, and making sure that we're relevant to them and their brands.
Perfect. And Jeremy, NBL has a bit of a unique market because it's a relatively, new to the sporting arena here in Australia. And I have to say, I went to a game on the weekend, and what you guys are doing in terms of sponsorship is amazing. I still can't get the sound of those tyre power clackers out of my head. But if we look to corporate sponsorship, you're entering into a market that it's heavily saturated. Corporate sponsors are looking for something different. So what is the NBL doing to maintain its unique position in that market, because it is privately owned? So.
Yeah, we've got a couple of competitive advantages in the fact that we can really push the envelope and do pretty much anything that we want with the product because we own it from beginning to end. So we own media production, we don't own image rights, but our players are very, very flexible in terms of activating on behalf of our sponsors. We've got a very loyal player group because of the fact that, let's not skirt around the issue, 4 years ago the league almost fell over and now it's in a pretty healthy space. And so we have a lot of goodwill behind the sport at the moment. We're looking to capitalise on that by doing things for partners that are really thinking outside of the box. So if you talk about it from a trends point of view, I think Billy's point about return on investment is absolutely key, but I would look at it more broadly on redefining what a return on investment means, because ordinarily that would be QI values and eyeballs on TV sets and how long your logo or the sponsor's logo was up on screen. Things have come so much further than that now because the return on investment isn't always calculated based on the equivalent media buy now. You've got to be able to demonstrate that you understand the sponsor's business and that you are achieving whatever objectives they need to achieve, and that's going to differ in every single instance. So being able to report on a real-time basis and provide an accountability dashboard to each of your sponsors that is tailored to their specific needs is something that I think we're able to do a little bit more readily for 2 reasons. One, our sport's a little bit smaller, makes it a little bit easier to come to terms with initially. And 2, again, because we own everything, we have transparency behind absolutely everything that's happening behind the scenes. So I think accountability is the real significant trend that's been developing over the last few years and that will continue to develop and get more and more sophisticated.
Andrew, if I just go back to you, with the return on investment, what are the clubs doing to measure that? You were involved and you mentioned the True North report. So can you give us a bit of insight, because it's not a matter of just flicking on the television screen or calculating likes on Facebook these days?
That's true. I wasn't involved in True North, but I have spent a bit of time with Georgie and Gary, who developed it in the last month, and it's a fascinating report. I think there still are 3 modes of looking at ROI. I think some people still want to read those eyeball ones. I think it's becoming less worthy as you do. But I think what was Replicom and what's now Nielsen Sports, there is still a market for that clearly. I think there's also that pure ROI, and I think that comes down to two areas. One is, if you're an airline sponsor and you sponsor a league, and the databases are so strong now that, you should be able to wash the airline's database over, say, the AFL or the NBL's database, and you should be able to see the absolute impact of how many ticket sales have gone through, or you can use, codes or coupons. And I know in the art space that's heavily relied on, and you can see that if you've spent $500,000 on a sponsorship and you've had a $1.2 million return in airline tickets, then, that's well worth continuing. There's an interesting report, and I know we're going to talk about it a bit more this afternoon on the athlete marketing panel, but KPMG did a study around the ROI of Ronaldo moving to Juventus from Real Madrid, and it's called Ronaldo Economics, and you can Google it and have a look and I think download the report. But that was a 340 million euro deal over 4 years that you need to get your money back from. And when you start breaking that down to game day ticket sales or merchandise or sponsorship or broadcast rights in their case, because they can push their own club's broadcast rights, you can then start seeing the ROI there too. I think the final one is around this emotional connection and this fan connection. I think in brand marketing, we've always looked for brand studies that have given us an understanding of that emotional connection. And in the sports industry, that's that fan engagement. And I do think this benchmark study is one of the first that I've seen around the world that actually does that. And when you start thinking through some of the results that I've had a look at over the last month, they really do make a lot of sense as to why fans are engaged. And I think we've probably not looked at fan engagement in the two ways that this report has. One is we've always looked at how do we engage with our fans within our club, but I think what this study's showing is what fans of the league, but not of that club, think of that sponsorship and that club. And that's, if you're spending a lot of money on sponsorship, you don't necessarily, want people to be dissing that brand because they're not liking where that club might be at. So that's an important change, I think, in how we look at ROI of these things.
That's really interesting. And I should say, if anyone has questions for the panel, just use the hashtag MIS2018 and we'll be able to feed them through to our panellists. Now, Sam, if I go back to you, and we're talking about the women's game here. So we've got the likes of Sam Kerr, we've got Emma Checker, Alana Kennedy. They're really using their own social media platforms to advance the game. So how do you see this developing in terms of how FFA engages with its athletes and capitalising on their personal profiles with sponsor engagement?
Yeah, look, again, first and foremost, we're in a difficult situation in the sense that what we've seen play out over many decades in the men's game with talent going overseas is probably on the cusp of happening for us in the women's game. So lots of press around Sam Kerr coming back home to play with the Perth Glory and making sure that happened. So when we look at that as part and parcel of we want to be putting the best women's football product out there possible, we need all our Westfield Matildas back in Australia. So we are working towards plugging the pay gap that does exist. So anything that the athletes can be doing off their own bat and making sure that there is obviously for them a return and the option to come home is not so disparate to the option of playing overseas in the US and Europe is a positive for us. So it's something that we encourage. We manage that from a sponsor standpoint to make sure that our major partners are obviously protected in categories that we want to make sure that we preserve value in. The value back to the FFA, I think, is pretty clear. We put the great product on. This year we've been lucky in having Fox Sports come on board. We have a standalone Westfield W League game on a Thursday evening. That doesn't happen again if you don't have the best talent coming back into this country and playing. So it's a great step forward to have a standalone Westfield W League game on a Thursday night, making sure that we've got national presence and broadcast for the women's game. Ultimately for us, that diversity and that gender diversity particularly is a huge appeal for our sponsors. When we look at the Westfield Matildas and their success overseas, when we look at what they can build in terms of profile, the support that you may have seen across both Newcastle and Penrith, where the Matildas have been hosted the last 2 years, has been phenomenal. We've got the women on the field well over an hour after that game finishes, signing autographs. We've got letters and social posts coming back to the FFA around how wonderful it is for mums to see their 8 and 9-year-old now with a female sports role model, and the fact that they never had that 20, 30 years ago growing up, right? So all that stuff is the emotional connection that Andrew mentioned, and it's really hard to put a value on that but it's something that we want to keep investing in, making sure that our girls get the chance to be at the forefront. And ultimately, we are bidding for a 2023 Women's World Cup. So that will be the ultimate payoff for us in terms of the women's game, football, and building that legacy that continues for decades to come.
Perfect. And Jeremy, I guess with the Female Basketball League, the Opal's a well-known team, which we got to see in the report that's been released from Georgie as well. But I guess what is the NBL doing in terms of sponsorship engagement? Do you have different platforms, different approaches for the women's versus the men's team, and what are sponsors responding to?
So importantly, I'll make the distinction that we own the NBL, we don't own the WNBL. We're a close partner with Basketball Australia, and we try to do our part to make sure that we're championing the women's game as well as the men's. And to that end, we actually started the website basketball.com.au, which, despite the fact that it's owned by us, it's a media platform for Australian basketballers wherever they happen to be. So we report on the men's game and the women's game here in Australia. We follow all of our Australian players wherever they happen to be playing in the world, including not just professionals but also university talent now as well. We've got over 400 kids playing college basketball in the US alone, 200 of which are female. We have an incredibly strong pipeline of both male and female talent coming through, and I spoke before about maximising on our competitive advantages. We happen to be the second best basketball team in the world from a women's perspective, and yeah, it's not new. It's not women coming to our sport for the first time and us getting behind them. They've been the second best team in the world for a very long time. We need to be more vocal about shouting it from the rafters, and it comes back to Sam's point as well about making Australia a more attractive destination for those top talent to return, and we've done that in the NBL now. It's only really the NBA guys who are Australian who aren't playing in the NBL. Almost all of the top tier talent from Europe has returned to Australia. And the impact on that for our sponsors has been enormous, because all of a sudden it's the Chris Goldings, Brad Newleys of the world who are fronting all of these sponsorship campaigns. And then we've taken that next step now and have Andrew Bogut back in the NBL from the NBA. The fillip that's given our sponsors. Our earned media this year is up 300% on last year. And we'd like to take a little bit of the credit for that, but also it's a massive Andrew Bogut effect. And the sponsors are the ones who come along for that ride.
Definitely, and as I said, I was at that game on the weekend, and the crowd was certainly getting behind him despite it being a Melbourne United home game. So there's been a lot of talk about the digital sports sponsorship over the last couple of days. So if we turn to more of the branded content, and that's increasing, and it's certainly the trends are changing over recent years. So what is the NBL doing in this space, and what are your views on how the sports industry can capitalise on this?
Yeah, branded content's a really interesting play. Historically, as a league or as a rights holder, you would put out content and you would try and sell a branding position into it. Now the ideation around the content is quite often the catalyst for the ideation is the sponsor, not the rights holder. A really good example of this is CPA Australia, who are a strong partner of ours for a couple of years, who came to us and said, one of the issues we have is that people understand we're an industry body, a member-based body, but don't really understand what we do other than throw a Christmas party for accountants at the end of each year. When in fact what they were seeking to do was teach accountants other business skills, and in particular a focus on leadership and strategy. And so we started kicking around some ideas, and because we own the broadcast and could do basically whatever we wanted to do, we ended up coming up with a new session after half-time in every single game called the CPA Australia Let's Talk Strategy session, where you'd grab a head coach from one of the two teams and talk about the strategy for the second half. So it gives an opportunity to a sponsor to develop bespoke content that is actually relevant to the brand, and it's organic in this instance. And two, as a rights holder, it makes you start thinking about things from a different point of view, and all of a sudden you're not thinking about sponsorship, you're thinking about true partnership. And so that then leads to conversations with the likes of CPA about, well, how do we leverage off what you're doing from a leadership and strategy point of view, and how does that roll in to benefit stakeholders in our league?
Perfect. Andrew, we've just got a question from Chris Tomlinson. Why are rights holders less willing to accept performance-based sponsorship if they believe they can deliver ROI for potential sponsors?
Good question. Look, I think we're seeing it in business. I think my old industry of advertising is far more likely to be driven by some performance bonus. You do some great marketing campaigns, and if you deliver, you get rewarded on that. And I can't see why that shouldn't happen. I do think one of the challenges, I wrote about this in the Australian last year, is that I think sport is at an all-time, it's a very popular pastime here in Australia, but at the moment, sports sponsorship's getting a pretty bad rap. So, I think the headline I wrote was, "Why, if sport's so popular, why is sports sponsorship so unpopular?" And I think people are wary about some of the downsides of sponsorship, and obviously, we've had all sorts of player issues over the years and things like that. And I think, when you've got so many different marketing channels to utilise, and sponsorship is just one of those channels, people are a bit more concerned. But I do believe that it can deliver an outcome, and we've seen that time and time again. And I believe that there's no reason why you couldn't have performance reward on the ROI. I think the brave clubs and brave leagues would happily do that.
Yeah, we love it, and we do it all the time. A lot of our contracts are performance-based. There's usually a base in there as well, but absolutely driven on KPIs. And take a local example, not in our code, but I know for a fact that the Brisbane Lions are basically a small car dealer for Hyundai, and it's a no-brainer for Hyundai to renew that deal each year or every few years because of the fact that the numbers just speak for themselves. So we love it. We're very big on under-promising and over-delivering, so anything that includes an incentive, bring it on.
Yeah, I think to echo Jeremy's sentiment, and Hyundai being a great example as our major sponsor for the Hyundai A-League, we see that over and over. Caltex and their Socceroo sponsorship, again, the performance bonus, both in terms of off-field and on-field, right? So again, divorcing kind of those two, we also put at risk what our guys can do on the park in terms of progression through tournaments and qualification through tournaments.
Yeah, Jeremy, there's just been a question from Greg, and I guess this will come back to the sponsorship impact and what you can do to develop the league. And he's mentioned how you've announced the Melbourne Phoenix deal, and Tanya mentioned that yesterday as well. But he wants to know, how many teams do you think will be competing in the NBL in 5 years' time? So what impact would sponsorship have on that?
Yeah, 5 years' time is an interesting one. I would say, so we've got 9 teams next year. We will most likely have 10 teams the year after that, and then I envisage the industry consolidating for a few years, but the 5-year mark, probably heading towards 12. And I think that's a factor of non-dilution, essentially. So we don't want to dilute talent across too many teams too soon. And the other one is the point you just alluded to, which is needing all of those clubs to be financially sustainable, and therefore not wanting to dilute the offering across too many sponsors too soon. We don't want to be reliant on having to go and secure too many sponsors when really we're still in our infancy in terms of our evolution.
All right, we'll make those comments off record then. Sam, now we're looking at the FFA and corporate sponsors. I know when we're looking at it from a Mint Ellison perspective, we're after those money can't buy experiences. We don't need a front of shirt sponsor. We don't need the actual activations on the field. So what are you doing in terms of placement in the market in offering those experiences, whether it's access to the players on game day or the team strategy lunches with the coaches? We've held some really good ones with Brumbies head coach over the years, and the corporate clients are really picking up on that. So what's the FFA doing in that space?
Yeah, good question, Cassandra. I think we'd probably make that distinction between there's kind of the B2C and the B2B space. I think the best example of our B2B space is AJ Gallagher, an insurance broker who's a sponsor of our FFA Cup, which is kind of a wonderful competition, 700 plus clubs from grassroots all the way through to kind of elite football in Australia. Recently hosted our final in Adelaide at Cooper Stadium, and we had AJG come down onto the field through the warm-up, literally do a sideline walk with some of their customers, and that was a key part of why they wanted to obviously invest and become a partner. So those experiences are truly money can't buy. The fact that you're literally standing on the field, watching a warm-up happen 20 minutes before kickoff and soaking in all that atmosphere, that's the kind of stuff that truly makes a difference in contracts.
And Andrew, what are you seeing in that space as well with the money can't buy developments?
Look, I think it's just another avenue that is a possibility to leverage, and I think a lot of the players in particular are understanding that that's part of what they need to do from here on in. I'm actually seeing it as well in the arts world as well as the sports world. with these money can't buy. And I think, I know Rod Harries is coming up this afternoon, and he's got a whole platform that delivers those sorts of things. But I think it's the openness of the players to understand what both fans and sponsors are looking for in that side of things.
I'll chime in unwelcomely, but still. We love our sport for the reason that it operates in a cauldron where everyone is right on top of the action, and so these money can't buy opportunities are rife in basketball, and we're very spoilt in that regard because it's not difficult to put two key customers of a major sponsor at the end of the bench so that they can hear and see and literally smell everything that happens, and it's the sweat and the pheromones and everything. You become part of the action. Your heart starts racing that little bit faster. But if you think about the money can't buys from what people want to get from them, is it just a gratuity to give a supplier or a customer a pat on the back, or is it actually that you want some of your executive management team in there as a learning opportunity, in which case we take them down into the rooms at half time and they get to, the local example, they get to go into the Brisbane Bullets rooms at half times and listen to an Olympic coach in Andre Lamanis rev up a team after they've had a good or a not so good half. It's truly educational, as well as being entertaining. We think those are becoming more and more valuable to our sponsors as they also become more sophisticated in understanding how they can make the most of those money can't buy experiences.
That's it. It's certainly a lot happening there. So I want to ask you all this. If we look worldwide, what team or company do you think has got it just right in terms of sponsorship? We've already mentioned the Juventus and Ronaldo deal. So maybe, Sam, if we start with you.
Yeah. Look, I think for me, and this is probably before my time literally in sport, the All Blacks always sort of stood out. I think the simplicity, obviously it helps when you've got a whole nation behind you, and that kind of, singular mindset. But I think they've always been kind of, in terms of the jersey, the palette, what you see, it's really clean. You get cut through. I think some of the stuff they then do with Air New Zealand and sort of bring that human element to the brand as well, and obviously maintaining a performance level and a culture and sweeping the sheds and all that, I think, is a proposition that makes them really attractive and sort of, for me, up there in terms of aspiration.
One example that sticks out in my head is Real Madrid, and the way that they've gone about, I'll say, incentivising their players to become ambassadors for the brands that they partner with almost incidentally, because of the fact that in a lot of instances, particularly when they had Ronaldo, the partner couldn't necessarily afford to sponsor both the club and the player, but they did some really clever things, for example, with Audi. So Real Ciudad, I think it's called, the city of Real Madrid, where they've got their 24/7 hotel for all the players. What do they have right out the front is their Audi car park. So you can only park out the front if you turn up to practice or to the hotel in your Audi. And now all the guys, they don't want to walk from the other car park, so they drive the Audi to work instead of whatever their other car might be. I think that's been a really clever way of bringing on board ambassadors almost intuitively.
I think the other one is that I think we're now, the brands that are seeing sponsorship as a long-term investment is one that I'm enjoying. I mean, there's a whole argument right now about long-term and short-term investment in marketing. Short-term isn't driving long-term, and I think you need to find a good combination of both. And even locally, when I think about, I mentioned before, Myer with horse racing, KFC with cricket, QBE with the Sydney Swans. I mean, they've been 10 to 20-year sponsorships that clearly have been working for those brands, and they've stuck to them as long-term brand building exercises. So.
All right, well, just to finish us off, if you all could tell me in one sentence, what do you think will be the biggest sponsorship trend for 2019 and beyond? So, Andrew, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think as we do go toward this ROI piece, I think leveraging your sponsorship better is going to be clear. I think misalignment is another key one that hasn't been spoken about a lot. I think sometimes we sponsor things for the sake of sponsoring things, but I think having that true alignment that then emotionally connects with fans.
I think our job as a rights holder is to make a marketing manager or a sponsorship manager look good. We need to help them tick their objectives, and with that in mind, I think real-time reporting, real-time accountability is going to be absolutely fundamental in terms of being able to give a sponsor comfort before they sign on the dotted line, I think that'll be key in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I think for me it's probably social utility to kind of put a concept together around that, making sure that you stand for something. And then literally from a marketing standpoint where people draw budgets may also start to branch out in terms of their own community work and where you start to dig into that stuff. But having a purpose and driving a kind of positive message around social change and action.
That's it. All right, well, it's been an interesting discussion with you all. I certainly have learned a lot, and I think we've got a lot to think about for years to come. So if you could all please join me in thanking Jeremy, Andrew and Sam for this morning's panel.
Cassandra Heilbronn from Ellison, thank you very much. Carried that off with aplomb. And to Sam Christou, Jeremy Loeliger and Andrew Baxter, thank you very, very much.